Welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, the business program for business, by business, about business. For some time now, I've been concerned that businesses in New Zealand generally don't understand much about what happens internationally and the institutions that support international business. One such institution, the OECD, Organisation for Economic Development, an outfit that New Zealand's been associated with for many years. Now, we're very fortunate here in New Zealand to have one Phil O'Reilly. Now, Phil O'Reilly doesn't need a lot of introduction to the business community, as for many years he was the Chief Executive of Business New Zealand. And during the currency of his appointment there, became closely associated with the OECD, and subsequently became chairman of BIAC, which is the Business Advisory Council of the OECD, and for many years has travelled around the world representing that body. And a lot of people in New Zealand don't realise how important that really is for New Zealand, what it means in terms of our trade agenda, and the places it's taken New Zealand to. So, welcome to Business at the Speed of Coffee, Phil O'Reilly.
Hey Kim, how you going, mate?
It's good to see you, and of course you're an old face on television around New Zealand.
Indeed.
Now, you weren't always associated with the international business community. To give our viewers a bit of context, tell us a little bit about where life started for Phil O'Reilly.
Well, actually, I grew up in Mount Roskill in West Auckland. My father
West?
was West, exactly. Back in those days when it was the West. My mother was a nurse, my father was an engineer, and I was the first person in my family to wear a suit to work, as a matter of fact. I was the first person in my family to get a postgraduate degree. So, for some time, it was a bit of a weird thing for my family to see what I was doing. And I started out, in fact, in Auckland, at the Auckland Employers Association, these days EMA, started out as an industrial advocate for employers. My father was a union official, and in his spare time.
He was? Okay.
And that's right, he was. And he encouraged me to get into industrial relations, and I did that, and that's where I started out in the business community, and I still do industrial relations today.
Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing today.
Well, the thing I run now is what I call a public policy advisory firm. So we align ourselves around good public policy outcomes. That's what I was after at Business New Zealand. I still am. And we work with whoever can get us there. So we'll work with central government agencies, local government, and businesses both in New Zealand and abroad, usually across those boundaries. So, for example, I work with central government towards the business community. I work with local government towards central government. And this is a business program, so I spend a lot of time dealing with businesses who need to deal with Wellington. So it's not lobbying, that's a different thing. It's really about helping those businesses understand how Wellington works, and then helping them in their interrelationships with bureaucrats, with Wellington officials of one sort or another, so that they can actually get their ideas across, make sure that they're going to be as persuasive as possible. I'm working long-run, big strategies with those organisations.
Would you say, for your business, that our government interaction is more complicated, say, than elsewhere?
Well, in many ways it's more simple. I often make a joke to people. They say, how can I talk to that politician? I say, it's easy. Just go along to the Wellington Koru Club at 6 o'clock on any given Thursday. They'll be there. You can have a beer with them.
Yeah.
So actually access in New Zealand isn't the issue. But what that means is that businesses often turn up in Wellington thinking it will be easy, and of course it's not. Wellington has different language, it has different time horizons, it has different wants and needs, different ways of demonstrating success. So if you're a business person going to Wellington, wanting to make sure that you get your say, you need to understand the difference between Wellington and, say, Auckland, and that's my business. I do a lot of that kind of work.
Phil, for a number of years we had, let's be frank, under Sir John Key we had a business-friendly government, and clearly the numbers indicated we grew. Some would argue that other things didn't get done. The coalition government, how do you feel about their response to business and how they deal with business?
Well, they're not business unfriendly. I mean, they're not anti-business. It's just that they don't know much about business. Not many of them come from a very business sort of focused background. And so, as usual with governments of that type, you need to do a lot of explaining about how business would operate and how business thinks. Now, they've been in power for 18 months or so, and they're getting a lot better at understanding that. I mean, a lot of that's going away. But the other problem that they have with regard to business, at least, is that the coalition is a rather uncomfortable sometimes coalition of three parties. Yeah. And that could lead to a lot of uncertainty from a business perspective. You're not quite sure what decision they're going to make. They can come up with...
They're not that sure themselves.
Well, exactly, because they need to go through this kind of negotiation. And that's why when I talk to clients, I really stressed to them the importance of dealing with officials, because dealing with those senior officials in particular means they're not going anywhere. They're still the same people that were there for many years. And so if you can explain your idea to them, you'll get a better understanding of how the political process is likely to work, and that'll help you with the clarity of getting it done in Wellington, despite the fact that Wellington can at times be a very confusing place under this government.
I think we all have to say we're surprised at how well this coalition has actually functioned. I think most people predicted it was not a chance, but things go on.
Yeah, and that's a lot of that's to do with the officials as well, because they provide the kind of support the government needs.
Yeah.
The little challenges that go forward. I mean, we're in a very difficult international and domestic economic situation right now.
You can see it in the confidence figures right now.
Well, precisely right. But some of those confidence figures, not all of them, but a bit of that confidence number is about government saying so about the business community saying to government, what are you doing for us? What's your story for us? And part of the challenge is the government really doesn't have one right now other than R&D tax credits.
Yes.
So I think one of the challenges that the government's got, and I tell them this myself all the time, they really need to come forward with what does something in this for business start to look like. And the engagement of Phil Twyford as the new Minister of Economic Development may well be a signal that they want to get along this track, and if they do, good for them.
As much of a lampooning in some quarters have had from this wellness budget, frankly, I think in there would be some very good policy signals if they just join the dots up.
Precisely right. I mean, who isn't after wellness? I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't go to work just to get money. The money I want is about my wellness, my happiness. That's the whole idea.
I think we've all had nervousness about the GDP number on its own.
Exactly.
But I'm the number I'm interested in is real disposable income, and where the money is going to go and how you use it.
Precisely.
And I think there are some real policy signals there. I just like to see them join the dots up.
And I think the other thing is that the last budget, they really didn't have an economic development story. No. And to your point, they can. A wellness story includes economic development, because that's about jobs. I think that they should listen to, personal view here, I think they need to listen to James Shaw more, because I think in the green economy, there is an enormous number of opportunities which are being missed. That's right.
I don't see them really giving enough credibility and incentive for people to start investing in the green economy.
That's right. Some of the language they use is absolutely the right language. They use the language of diversification. They use the language of sustainability. That's all entirely sensible. But what they need to be doing more of is explaining to the business community what that actually means and how the business community can engage. And that's the challenge that they've got right now. They haven't really done that effectively.
Iron Duke is the place to go to get that explained.
Exactly right, of course.
You started visiting the OECD. Mm-hmm. Now tell us a little bit about what the OECD actually is, how it's funded and how it operates.
So the OECD came out of the post-war settlement, a thing called the Marshall Plan, that was set in place to revive Europe. And the Americans really came to Europe and they said, let's invest heavily, because they realised they'd made a mistake
nation building
in the First World War. That's exactly right. And so they set up a thing called the Marshall Plan, which turned into the OECD, which in English is the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. These days, that organisation has 38 members now, mainly the developed world, effectively, so all of Western Europe, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, the United States, and so on. Lots of LATAM these days, also Latin America these days, are members of it. The idea of it is to be a big think tank for the developed world. So it has a huge number, 1,500 staff based in Paris largely. And it's really
a magnificent place.
It's a stunning place in Paris, of course it is. But the whole idea is that these guys run, they're essentially economists, and they're going to run lots and lots of experimentation. They do lots and lots of studies on what success looks like and what works. Then they'll make recommendations to countries accordingly.
They send people out to visit, don't they?
They do. That's part of what they do. Yeah. So we've just gone through a New Zealand report. The OECD's just done a New Zealand report. Go to the OECD website and you'll see it. And they come to New Zealand, interview lots of people, including business people. Then they make some recommendations to New Zealand about what we might do to improve our economy and improve our environment.
Those recommendations, and I've read many of them, how influential do you think they really are on our own policy setters here in New Zealand?
In New Zealand, they're very influential with officials. Sometimes the politicians don't want to hear them, and sometimes they do, so they're going to clap at the ones they like, of course.
Yes.
But I can assure you that when it comes to the bureaucracy, they're very, very influential, because New Zealand's only small.
There's this debate about the neoliberalism, and now we've got populism, all the thing. Where does they settle? In the middle somewhere, or are they more on the left of the social spectrum? Where do you think most of their stuff ends up?
Largely they're policy-based, largely they're really evidence-driven, so they just say what actually happens. Now sometimes that can be uncomfortable for business, of course, because one of the big things that they're saying right now is that growth needs to be more inclusive, and I think that's right. Yeah. But nevertheless, the way in which they say it can sometimes feel a little bit confronting to business, because they'll suggest that some more regulation of labour markets might be necessary to achieve that outcome and so on. So there's never a case where policy advice of the sort that the OECD hands out is going to be free of politics. Of course it isn't. But largely, business can trust the OECD to be evidence-driven. And of course, they're listening very closely to my business organisation every day based in Paris to get business input to their recommendations.
So, sitting astride of the OECD, which is this large bureaucracy, there is another bureaucracy, which is BEAC.
Yep, that's right.
And you're chairman of this august body. Tell me, what does it look like, that BEAC council?
It's not very big. It's only 10 staff based in Paris.
Well,
but
it's a fair number, over there.
It is a reasonable, it's certainly a very powerful body. So about a year after the OECD started, 52 years or so ago, the organisation decided that they really wanted a couple of reference groups to help them in their policy making, just as governments do in domestic settings. And they set up the Business and Industry Advisory Committee, or BEAC. These days we call it Business at OECD. And they set up a Trade Union Advisory Committee, which is chaired by the chairman of the AFL-CIO, as a matter of fact, at the moment. And that group, its members are the apex, the big business organisations of the OECD 38 member states.
So let's get this right. As chairman of that group,
yep,
you're rubbing shoulders on a daily basis with all the senior leaders of the UK and Germany, I guess, the USA, Canada, and so on.
Japan, you bet.
And this is a tough question. Comparing those sorts of people to the kind of business people you meet in New Zealand, how do we rate?
Well, our best are as good as their best. The point, though, is that the reason they're in Paris is they're much more interested in global affairs than the average New Zealand business person is. You know, I make a joke when I turn up in Paris that I've come all the way from New Zealand, and people still shake their heads and can't understand why I would come that far to be so engaged. But, of course, New Zealand needs to be engaged. Of the OECD 38, New Zealand is the smallest and most isolated developed economy. So we just need to be there.
I agree.
And it takes hours and hours and hours to travel up there. But it puts you in rooms that are absolutely remarkable with very, very senior business people who will listen when you have to say something.
It's important for our viewers to hear this. Mr. O'Reilly's flown all around the world to be at these meetings, rubbing shoulders with the leaders of the world. And every OECD report I've read, and our Productivity Commission report has said the same thing, that productivity is lagging behind. And there's a backstory of that, and I totally agree that now we're talking about the wellness budget here in New Zealand. Behind it, of course, is a lack of growth in real disposable income and the incredible cost of accommodation in New Zealand. Those two vectors drive what I think are relatively poor growth in living standards. And I see you nodding, what prescription would come out of BEAC or indeed the OECD to do something about that in New Zealand?
Largely it's about gaining more productive firms through better investment in technology, better investment in digital, better investment in plant and equipment, and then the higher skills that come from that in the economy. Now that's incredibly difficult in a New Zealand that only has a very small economy. The size of the economy of New Zealand is now significantly smaller than the size of the economy of Sydney, Australia, for example. And we're incredibly isolated. We're a long way away from markets. So what we need to do is build the sophistication of our business community in order that they will see the need to invest in these kinds of technologies at the moment.
When you're so far away from markets that it is inherently risky to run a business, that the government's job is to make it less so, that people will actually actively engage. In one area where I think that we've been incredibly well served is through MFAT, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and how they box well above their weight in getting trade deals across the line. When you're at BEAC in Paris and they look across, they must look in horror at what's happening with the international trade agenda, both Brexit, of course, and the tensions which come from the Middle East, but more importantly what Mr. Trump's up to. What is their response to this? And what should we do?
Well, I just keep on pushing the fact that we need to get on with trade. One of the real challenges we've got is that global trade is dropping behind global GDP or global overall growth for the first time in many, many years. And normally when that happens, that's a global recession coming up. And so that's a real big risk for us. What we need to do is actually a couple of things. One, we need to stay the course. We need to continue to engage in free trade negotiations and in trade. We need to pull together friends, people like us around the world, and there's lots of them. Then we need to get on with resolving the international rules-based system. So just in a few weeks' time, I'll be going back to Geneva, not to the ILO this time, but the World Trade Organization, which is based in Geneva, which is just an existential crisis right now, a real problem of the global trading system.
The US or Mr. Trump particularly, won't appoint its required judge. Is that right?
That's right. So there's a process
so that
inside the
institution's
WTO.
at risk.
That's right. It really is. There's a process at the WTO where if I in New Zealand think you and the US are causing a problem of not following the rules, I can take it off to an adjudication process in the WTO. The US is effectively blocking that.
But isn't there an irony when they feel aggrieved, they still go there?
Well, what's interesting is that this is one of the things about New Zealand, because we're so small. We need the WTO. The US has aircraft carriers at the end of the day. They have big power. And you saw that at the G20 meeting in Osaka a few weeks ago with President Trump and President Xi sort of going at it. So if you're a big economy, you can kind of get away without so many rules. But if you're a small economy like us, you absolutely need the rules. Hence me going there all the time on behalf of New Zealand and global business saying, hey, these rules-based things, OECD, WTO, ILO, B20, the G20 process, another one, we really need these processes, and New Zealand needs them more than just about any other economy.
If you have a person occupying the White House who's quite happy to insult the British senior diplomat, and
mind you, he insulted the president too.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was but I mean that it was not a healthy sign. No matter who is at fault, it's just not healthy. How does it really? I mean, how did he get there? Is it? How did that? I mean, it was the state of Ohio basically that got him there. How did that happen?
Well, of course, the people of Ohio and some of those Rust Belt states, what we might call the poor white community, that's how it's referred to in the US, felt as though China was taking their jobs and felt as though the federal government and state governments weren't supporting them in their income. Now, in fact, that's not quite true. As a matter of fact, if you look at the data and the statistics, in fact, it was digital that took those jobs away from the United States, not Chinese manufacturing. Chinese manufacturing would have happened anyway, and those people might have understood you have a wealthier China, maybe you can sell some stuff to those Chinese people.
More consumers.
But this was a problem of political economy, what we call political economy. That wasn't being explained well to those voters in the Rust Belt states. They thought they were being left behind, and indeed they were. Those real disposable incomes weren't going north, and so they felt as though they should get away from what they saw as the club of the Clintons and the club of the Democrats and invest in someone who was going to blow it apart. Whether Trump actually has achieved that or not, who knows? But what you have seen is that real labour rates, real incomes in the US have started to move north, not necessarily because of President Trump's trade wars maybe, but more because of his tax cuts and what he's done around...
huge business confidence investment.
Exactly right, and the red tape removal and so on, probably more likely to be impactful here.
Clearly his immigration stance, which has been to many people obnoxious, actually hasn't changed much at all, other than a lot of discontented people. But immigration around the world is an issue.
Sure is.
Where does the OECD and BAC stand with immigration?
Well, we stand for immigration, but we stand for immigration that doesn't bust apart communities. And what you saw was in Germany, for example, where 1 million Syrians came in at basically no notice. That caused enormous social dislocation, even though, in fact, those people coming in were probably net good for the economy because you've got an ageing population in Germany, and you know there's young people coming through. So it just demonstrates the importance of managing immigration well. And in New Zealand, we need to manage it well as well. We need to make sure that as we get migrants coming in, which I think is a 99% good thing for New Zealand, that we have the right infrastructure, the right kinds of things that people don't feel as though they're a burden on society and feel, in fact, that migrants might help them become wealthier, as a matter of fact.
Well, clearly, we need the business community is crying out for skilled people. I happen to think our system is at its core correct, but it has to be managed. I think execution is important.
That's exactly right.
And that the feedback loops were because often the list of people that the immigration people think we need isn't exactly what's needed on the ground.
Well,
so
precisely right.
Speeding that process up, I think, is all that needs to be happening. I noticed that the US has been quoting us as a system they might like to follow.
That's because we have a skills-based immigration system, and the US doesn't actually. The US has more like a ballot-type system. It might be hard for New Zealanders to understand that, but it does lead to some of the tension. President Trump has managed to exploit that quite well, but it goes to, I think, the importance of understanding global things. You know, when you read the newspapers about President Trump, you'd think that he was a complete idiot and totally stupid and so on. In fact, just dig beneath that, because with any president of the United States, just like any politician, they'll do some things you hate and some things you love. And so it's very important, I think, to dig beneath some of those, pretty lazy media portrayals and focus on what you really dislike about Trump. And there's plenty of that, of course, to go around. But at the same time, have a think about what the Trump administration is doing that might actually be in New Zealand's interest.
Well, the tribal instincts that sit across all world politics now is not very helpful.
No, indeed.
And let's hope that it doesn't quite get so bad here in New Zealand.
No evidence that it's going to, I must say, which is helpful.
I've always been very allergic to red tape.
Yes.
The interesting thing is, obviously, New Zealand's the easiest place to start a business, the hardest place to make any money.
Exactly, yes.
Yet, we look at, with horror on the planning systems and the red tape that goes into building houses or roads. Yet there doesn't seem to be any appetite in New Zealand to reduce the red tape. And there's one thing I have to hand to Mr. Trump. He came up with this idea that for every regulation you're going to put in, I'm going to take one off.
Yep.
That seems to have merit, doesn't it?
Well, the idea of having a regulatory reform agenda certainly has merit. And you hear a lot of the stuff around Donald Trump and the Twitter and all the rest. Actually, there's elements of his agenda that are very, very pro-business and quite sensible. And this removal of red tape is one of them. And it has led to growth in the US economy, despite the other sort of strange stuff that he gets into. So we could do the same here. We're already quite good when it comes to red tape. I mean, compared to many parts of the world, easiest to start a business. Hard to grow one though, as I know. So what we need to do, I think, is concentrate in those areas of red tape where there really are some roadblocks. And you've highlighted the Resource Management Act and you've highlighted planning legislation. Those are things that if we really got ourselves sorted out, then we could make a big difference, I think.
From my experience anyway, I yet to come across a senior business leader who doesn't care about the environment. Now, there'll be arguments about how, but there is in this country anyway, high concern about the environment and also welfare of all New Zealanders. None of us want to walk up the street and fall over, people lying on cardboard.
You bet.
The question is, I think, and then the argument maybe arises from what to do about it. Now, you've most recently been involved in the special group that was discussing...
The welfare group, yep, that's right.
Yes. Yep. And I think you came up with 47 or 37, was a 42 recommendations. How many of those is anyone done anything about?
Well, I asked that question actually, and they were keen to have me there because I'd done some work in child poverty previously, as a matter of fact, even though I don't have any children, I'm not particularly poor, but nevertheless they said I should be on it. And the idea that they had in particular was they wanted someone who understood labour markets, and that was me, and a guy called Robert Reid from the union side was there as well. He's a good guy, Robert. If you lose your job, the government will only start to assist you once you've lost your job, and then they'll only assist you until you get your next job. Yeah. Now that sounds like it should be the right thing.
Time thing, yeah.
But the point is that what tends to happen is you get a lesser job than the job you left. So when you hit the welfare queue, when you hit the unemployment benefit, actually what that system does is it means maybe you were being paid $60,000 when you got onto welfare, you'll come out being paid $45,000. Now that's really, really bad for our economy. I want you to be back earning $60,000 or $70,000 a year because you're able to look after your family and you're able to pay some tax.
Do I hear things like retraining?
Absolutely. So what we recommended in the welfare group was much more active labour market policies as it looks as though you might lose your job, to stop you losing your job, and then a lot more training while you're on the dole queue to make sure that you get a job that you want to keep. One of the weird things about about how social welfare works in New Zealand is it says you should just go get the next job available, Kim.
No matter what it is. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, which is when you're an employer, that's crazy. Why would you employ someone like that when they don't want to be there? Wouldn't you want someone who wants to be in the labour market? So, in your job, as a matter of fact. So, a lot of the recommendations we came up with, Robert and I, were around that idea. Now, to their credit, government is trying to do something about that, and whether it works or not, I don't know, but at least they're true to that idea. And we should all be, in the business community, interested in these kinds of outcomes, because here's another frightening statistic. About half of all those on long-term benefits have some sort of disability. Now that's outrageous.
Is that right?
About either a mental or a physical disability, some sort of learning disability.
That's a very high percentage.
It's extraordinary. So what are we doing about that? Why would we leave them on the sidelines? Why wouldn't we be investing heavily in trying to make sure they might be able to do a job at some stage? And we really don't. We leave them on the sidelines. So I can be a business person and an absolute capitalist and still think, that can't be right. What are we doing about that? Same debates are going on in all kinds of OECD member economies as well about what's the right outcome here about getting the business community operating, GDP growth happening, and at the same time making sure people aren't left behind unnecessarily.
Coming back to the social conscious and the environmental thing, I think there has been a misunderstanding that the business community is the enemy here.
Yep.
What's your view of that?
Well, I think that's right. And in fact, we've been trying to reach out to successive governments now over the last 10 to 15 years on that very matter, with some stumbles and some difficulty. But I look now that my clients certainly are all up for the Zero Carbon Act. They want a few changes, but they're up
some
for
leadership.
They want exactly what they want. And what you're seeing now around the world actually is the businesses are really taking the lead in this area, including on the UN Sustainable Development Goals and all the rest. You're seeing big global businesses really wanting to push forward. The reason is obvious. They have children too, and they're investing billions of dollars in capital that could be stranded. Those assets could be stranded if you get the climate change policies wrong. So businesses are calling out for this thing because businesses have kids, businesses are citizens, business people live in communities as well, and there's business opportunities associated with this kind of thing. That's what we're seeing globally, even more powerfully, in fact, than we are in New Zealand right now, because they can't be sure. That's
and
the
I
idea.
think people have used the excuse saying, well, if the US and China don't do it, why would we bother? I don't think I buy into that, because I think other countries are buying into doing something.
Exactly right. Well,
and the States and the US are too, aren't they?
They are, that's exactly right. And businesses are already acting. Businesses are acting with their checkbook, and we need to play a part in that. For New Zealand to simply say, we'll do nothing because we're small, would be the antithesis of everything we've stood for, including at the OECD and the ILO, ever since the Second World War. We have always said, New Zealand will play its part. New Zealand will do something as a result. And as a result of that, not only do we get the plaudits of the world, of course, but we also get real business opportunities for our companies to thrive and prosper in those economies, because they see us as being good actors and good citizens. So we can't stand to one side and do nothing here.
So, Phil O'Reilly, you've sort of come the full circle from working in business. Now you've got your own business.
Indeed.
And you've seen all the issues that arise in running a business. How optimistic are you for business in New Zealand?
Oh, I'm incredibly optimistic. But we need to make sure that we're being as aggressive and as forthright as we can about growth and about competition. If we're lazy, we'll simply get slightly poorer and slightly poorer and slightly less competitive over time. The new generation of business people I'm seeing come through give me a great deal of hope for the future.
One piece of advice, you're starting a new business.
Indeed. Actually, my big piece of advice would be get advice. I have a wonderful advisory board around the business, some old heads from the Wellington business and political community who help me out. I couldn't say more to any business person starting. Get advice, get an advisory board, not a real board, an advisory board, some people to sit around and help you guide the business in the early days. It certainly made my business what it is today.
Well, Phil O'Reilly, thanks for joining us at Business at the Speed of Coffee. It's been a great insight, and I wish you all the best on your journey in being a businessman.
Thanks, Ken.